Andrew Lowe was one of Savannah's more prominent citizens. He was a merchant, he was an entrepreneur, he was a family man, but technically there's two Andrew Lowes because we're talking about an uncle and a nephew. And the family of Lowe, which bridged about 5 generations in the book that me and my co-author have put together. First of all, this is a Scottish family. They are from the area of Kincardineshire on the east coast of Scotland. The Lowe family were not the most important people around. They were tenant farmers on the lands of the Lords Keith, who were the big shots in the neighborhood. And Scotland had been into a bitter conflict with England for years, and they had paid dearly for it. The Scottish could not do business outside of their nation. They were banned from doing commerce in the British Empire. But those restrictions were lifted in the early 1700s, and we see Scotsmen pour out over the British Empire with their skills attending ledgers and moving merchandise, and they appear all over America. And the Lowe family was one such Scottish family. It was more than just a family, it became a syndicate of the extended family of the Lowes, the Isaacs, the Taylors, and others. It started when Andrew Lowe left Glasgow. He had been trained as a young accountant and businessman, and he moved to Savannah, Georgia, and established himself in the new century, the 1800s, the early years. And he brought a cash investment with him that would have been provided by the family or a wealthier member in Glasgow, and he set up a shop in Savannah as a merchant who would be dealing with goods from England. He was very prosperous, bringing in goods from England and shipping out raw produce to England. And of course, the slave trade was part of this also. But we see commerce becomes the center of the family of Lowe, and he brings in nephews and others to Savannah to work for this enterprise. On several occasions brought nephews, cousins, and others in to try them out. They didn't work out. So they'd find a new fit. Maybe they would be captain of one of the ships that the syndicate owned, or maybe they would run an office in Glasgow or Liverpool. So the family always took care of the family as they expanded and moved on. But for Andrew Lowe Sr., the question would always be, who is the worthy one who should inherit my wealth and my business, since I am a bachelor in my older years? And the answer was that nephew, Andrew Lowe Jr. He rose to the expectation in Savannah. He came to Savannah and mixed and mingled with the social crowd, something that Uncle was too busy for, too much of a merchant to care about nighttime parties and things. But young Andrew was handsome. He was debonair, probably spoke with a little Scottish brogue, but that was okay in Savannah since there were so many Scotsmen. And he will slowly take over the business and prove to be an outstanding businessman. Now, the interesting thing is we always look at that Civil War as an interrupter of history. If it hadn't occurred, what would this have done or that have done? For Andrew Lowe, the answer would be he probably would have been a robber baron or a captain of industry. He was on that course, buying into railroads, multiplying his money, working off of 2 continents. He was by far the wealthiest man in Savannah prior to the Civil War. And had he not gotten so entangled in the Confederacy, in writing bonds, contesting missing merchandise with the federal government, he probably would have been one of those industrialists working alongside his homeland patriot, Mr. Carnegie, and others. So it could have been a different story, but that war interrupted it. Now, the interesting thing is Andrew Lowe Jr. made so much money that it allowed his children to live a life of leisure, for better and for worse. Andrew Lowe Jr. had 2 wives, both of them dying early in life, complications from childbirth. The first wife had 2 living children who became very prominent in English circles. One of them became married to an admiral who was knighted by the king, and so she became Lady Grenville, Amy Lowe, Lady Grenville. So it's interesting to notice that we start out with a family that literally were serfs on the land of the wealthy, who lived in a stone hut with a thatch roof, and they end up meeting the queen. And another child from the second marriage, William Mackay Lowe, lived a life of leisure with the sporting crowd. His entire agenda was, when will the horse races be so I can enter my horses? And when is the social season in London? And when does the hunting season open in Scotland? He revolved his life around that. And within that set, he met a very important person, the Prince of Wales, Queen Victoria's son. And they had those weekend parties that the Victorians were so well known for, when infidelities popped up. And this is an interesting part of the story because William Mackay Lowe was married to Juliet Gordon of Savannah. She, of course, will end up being the founder of the Girl Scouts. But as an early married woman, she is in the countryside of Warwickshire. She lives in Wellesbourne House, and right across the meadow is Warwick Castle. Another Daisy lives there, Daisy Warwick, Lady Warwick, the Lord's wife. And they were good friends, but they were gulfs apart in their personal ethics. Lady Warwick was quickly becoming the mistress to the Prince of Wales. In all these house parties, there were all sorts of signals to let you know who was available once people moved to their bedrooms. You know, a shoe placed outside the door pointing down the hall means I'm ready for this hour or that hour. And all sorts of little things like that went on. And the king always had his mistresses. And it's interesting to note, by following the dates within the king's life, that while he had dalliances with Lady Warwick, Lord Warwick was in Georgia, being hosted here in Savannah among his hunting trip he was on by Daisy Lowe's father, right over here on Oglethorpe Avenue. So while they were dining on terrapin soup and talking about fishing for tarpon, the Lord's wife was being anything but true to her husband across the ocean next door to Mr. Gordon's daughter. So these type things probably offended the young Daisy Gordon. She was not of that class, and infidelities were not part of her life or life in Savannah. There was another complication with her, and it was her hearing. It was going from bad to worst. She had had an eardrum problem in the past, and upon her marriage, she had a grain of rice embedded in the other ear, which irritated it, and the cure was worse than anything else. And she literally was deaf completely on one side and partially deaf on the others. And that probably muted her so that she couldn't enjoy big galas where people are talking and noises bouncing. She probably felt outside of things. She probably seemed odd to many of these lords and ladies when she would answer one question with a completely different answer, as deaf people normally do. And so she was isolated. And then the inevitable happened to her. Her husband found another woman. It was rather sad. Her sister-in-law had lost a child, and Willie Lowe took his sister Jessie to a seaside resort to have a weekend off from all of the pressures that she had felt. And there Mrs. Anna Bateman, a widow, spotted Mr. Lowe, and she moved in for the kill. She was everything his wife Daisy was not. She moved in circles. She didn't mind those new mores. And before you knew it, she had moved into Wellesbourne House with the Lowes in a separate wing. Daisy Lowe's status was sliding down. As their marriage becomes a verbal assault back and forth, she finds the ultimate indignity. Mr. Lowe told the servants only to obey Miss Bateman and not Mrs. Lowe. The handwriting was on the wall. She left her husband at that point. This was a serious problem in Savannah and in England. These things were normally quieted down. The king's affairs as such were never mentioned. It was just impolite. Marriage went on no matter what. And here this American woman is going to file for divorce. This is unthinkable. It was a sad situation for the turn of the century for this generations of Lowe. Mrs. Lowe is at her bottom point. She really has little or no allowance. The family is dividing, taking sides on all of this. And in the middle is this strange Mrs. Bateman who has Mr. Lowe around her finger. Unfortunately, he is kind of going down the tubes. Heavy drinking is affecting him in a negative way. Bouts of illness and other things are clouding him. And in 1906, he did die without executing the divorce while on a vacation trip with Mrs. Bateman to Ruthin Castle, the home of the Cornwall West family. And that was Winston Churchill's stepfather's castle where they were renting. Mrs. Bateman inherited everything that he had. He left some money to sisters and small accounts and an allowance to his wife, but Mrs. Bateman received almost everything. This was very traumatic, and a series of lawsuits followed, which were rather scandalous to say the least. Mrs. Lowe, however, finally found her own courage. When she moved out of her home, Wellsbourne House, she went on a trip up the Nile with her sister. She met several of Britain's military geniuses and generals who were in the Egyptian region at that time, and she became fast friends over time with one of them who was Lord Baden-Powell. Of course, he created the Boy Scouts in England, and Mrs. Lowe decided this could be replicated in America. This is when she finally found her voice, and she ends up coming back to Savannah to create an organization, as she said, for the girls in Savannah, in Georgia, in the United States, and everywhere else. And she started the program of Girl Scouts here in Savannah. The carriage house behind the building where we sit now was fitted out as the first national headquarters. And to Girl Scouts today who own that building, just the carriage house, it is still their first national headquarters. They're very proud of it. When they come to Savannah to see the birthplace of Daisy Lowe, they always visit the first national headquarters here in Savannah. And of course, now we sit in the home that Mrs. Lowe knew. This was Andrew Lowe Jr.'s home that he built for his first wife, who never lived to see it. He brought his second wife here, and after her death, this house was mostly closed up except for his occasional trips to America after the Civil War, because by then they were British citizens. They were not going to live in the poverty of the South after the war. And Mrs. Lowe received this after finally contesting the will of her husband. And this became her residence until the day she died. So this too is very important to Americans as the home of the founder of the Girl Scouts.